If you were to design a sporting event intended to kill as many participants as possible, you would likely come up with something very similar to the marathon at the 1904 St. Louis Olympics. It remains by far the strangest, most dangerous, and most surreal afternoon in the history of professional athletics. Imagine 32 men standing on a starting line in 90-degree heat with nearly 100% humidity. They are about to run 26 miles over terrain that wasn't paved, through clouds of choking dust with almost no access to water. By the time the sun set that day, the race would involve car chases, feral dogs, poison, and a man who nearly died because his internal organs were coated in a layer of fine Missouri silt. To understand how this disaster happened, we have to look at the man holding the starter's pistol. James Sullivan was the head of the physical culture department for the World's Fair, and he had a theory. He believed in purposeful dehydration. He wanted to test the limits of human endurance by withholding water from the athletes to see how the body would react. Sullivan provided only 2 water stations for the entire 26-mile course. One was a well at the 6-mile mark, and the other was a single water stand at mile 12. For the final 14 miles of the race in the blistering Midwestern heat, the athletes were expected to survive on nothing but their own grit. The course itself was a nightmare. It wasn't a flat city circuit. It was a rugged trail through the hills around St. Louis, featuring 7 massive inclines. The roads were never cleared of traffic. Delivery wagons, horses, and the newly invented automobile shared the path with the runners. As the cars sped past to catch a glimpse of the race, they kicked up massive clouds of dust that hung in the stagnant, humid air. Among the runners was a man named William Garcia. He was found collapsed on the side of the road, coughing up blood. When doctors finally reached him, they discovered that the dust from the support vehicles had coated his esophagus and torn the lining of his stomach. Had he not been found when he would have likely bled to death internally, a victim of a race that was as much a construction site as it was a marathon. But the physical danger was only half the story. The roster of athletes was a collection of characters so eccentric they seem like fiction. There was Felix Carvajal, a Cuban mailman who had raised money for his trip to the Olympics by running the length of Cuba and begging for donations. He arrived in St. Louis in a heavy, long-sleeved shirt and long trousers. A fellow athlete had to help him cut his pants into shorts just before the race began. Carvajal hadn't eaten in 40 hours. During the race, he was so hungry that he stopped in an orchard to eat some apples. The apples turned out to be rotten, causing him to suffer massive stomach cramps. He decided the only solution was to take a nap on the side of the road. Remarkably, after his nap, he woke up and still managed to finish in 4th place. Then there were Len Tao and John Masciani, the first Black Africans to compete in the modern Olympics. They weren't actually in St. Louis for the Games. They were part of a Boer War exhibit at the World's Fair. They entered the race on a whim, running barefoot. Len Tao was doing well until he was chased nearly a mile off course by a pack of aggressive stray dogs. Even with the detour, he finished 9th. As the race reached its midpoint, the heat began to break the favorites. This is where the story shifts from a comedy of errors into a medical horror show. Thomas Hicks, an American runner, was flagging. He was gray-faced and hallucinating, begging his trainers for a drink of water. Instead of water, his trainers gave him a cocktail. It consisted of 1/60th of a grain of strychnine mixed into a raw egg white. At the time, strychnine, better known today as rat poison, was thought to be a stimulant in small doses. It is, in reality, a potent neurotoxin. When the first dose failed to revive him, they gave him another. They washed it down with a glass of brandy. Hicks began to move like a mechanical toy, his legs lifting high and stiff, his eyes glazed over. He was no longer running a race. He was a walking experiment in chemical survival. He began to hallucinate that the finish line was 20 miles away when it was right in front of him. While Hicks was being poisoned into a stupor, another runner, Fred Lors, decided he'd had enough. At the 9-mile mark, his body gave out. He hopped into his manager's car and spent the next 11 miles waving at spectators from the passenger seat. When the car eventually broke down, Lors simply got out and ran the final few miles to the finish line. The crowd, unaware of the car ride, erupted in cheers. Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, was about to place a gold medal around Lors's neck when someone shouted that he was a fraud. Lors immediately admitted it, claiming he had only crossed the finish line as a joke. The officials were not amused. The actual winner, if you can call him that, was Thomas Hicks. He was literally carried across the line by his trainers, his feet still moving in a running motion while his body hung limp in their arms. He had lost 8 pounds during the race. It took 4 doctors to get him into a stable enough condition to even leave the stadium. He later said he would rather have died than won another marathon. When we look back at the 1904 marathon, it's easy to dismiss it as a primitive relic of a less civilized time. But there is a deeper, more unsettling scientific truth beneath the chaos. James Sullivan's experiment was based on the belief that human beings could be trained to ignore the biological necessity of hydration. That day in St. Louis proved the opposite. It showed that the human body is an incredibly resilient machine, but one that operates within very strict physical boundaries. Of the 32 men who started the race, only 14 finished. It remains the lowest completion rate in Olympic history. The race forced the sporting world to realize that endurance isn't just about the strength of the mind. It's about the support of the biology. The 1904 marathon changed the way we look at athletic safety, hydration, and the ethics of coaching. It was the first time the world saw what happens when the ego of a researcher overrides the safety of an athlete. Today, marathon runners have access to advanced electrolytes, climate-controlled environments, and meticulously planned courses. They run in shoes engineered by computers. But every time a runner stops for a drink of water at a modern race, they are subtly acknowledging the ghost of 1904. We remember the winners of most Olympics for their grace and their speed. But we remember the runners of 1904 for their survival. They were the men who ran through the dust, the poison, and the madness, proving that sometimes the greatest achievement isn't how fast you reach the finish line, but that you manage to reach it alive. The 1904 marathon stands as a monument to human absurdity. It is a reminder that the line between a legendary feat and a total disaster is often thinner than we'd like to admit. And perhaps, in its own strange way, it is the most honest race ever run. A pure, unfiltered glimpse into the chaos that ensues when we push ourselves beyond the edge of reason.